Tonight, we're stepping back through the centuries to explore a world where your most ordinary actions, your simplest thoughts, and even your most innocent pleasures would mark you as a sinner in the eyes of the church and society. While you're getting comfortable, please consider subscribe and comment below. What kind of stories do you want to hear in this channel? Imagine yourself waking up tomorrow morning in medieval Europe, perhaps in the year 1200, in a small village nestled between rolling hills and ancient forests. The sun filters through your small window, and as you stretch and yawn, you have no idea that you've already begun accumulating sins that would horrify the priests of your time. The simple act of oversleeping, of enjoying your warm bed, perhaps. A moment too long would already place a mark against your soul. You see, the medieval world was one where the boundary between the sacred and the mundane had dissolved entirely. Every breath, every gesture, every fleeting thought was scrutinized through the lens of Christian morality. The church, with its vast network of monasteries, cathedrals, and wandering friars, had woven itself so deeply into the fabric of daily life that there was no escape from its watchful gaze. Tonight, we'll explore this world together, moving gently through the shadows of a time when sin lurked in the most unexpected places. We'll walk through a typical day in medieval life, discovering how actions we consider perfectly normal today would have marked us as transgressors. We'll meet Marguerite Porete, a mystic whose profound spiritual writings led her to a terrible fate. We'll examine the meticulous records that medieval scholars kept of every conceivable sin. And finally, we'll see how the wealthy and powerful navigated this treacherous moral landscape. So settle back, close your eyes if you wish, and let yourself drift into a world where even the act of listening to this story might itself be considered a dangerous indulgence. The medieval world awaits, with all its contradictions, its fears, and its strange, dark beauty. The first pale light of dawn creeps through the shutters of your medieval home, and already, without even opening your eyes, you are walking a tightrope over the abyss of sin. The church teaches that sloth is one of the 7 deadly sins, and your reluctance to rise immediately for morning prayers has already marked your soul with the first stain of the day. You stretch beneath your woolen blanket, feeling the warmth of your bed, and this too is noted in the celestial ledger. The sin of luxuria, not just sexual lust, but any excessive pleasure in physical comfort. As you finally rise, your bare feet touch the cold stone floor of your humble dwelling. The very fact that you slept without clothing, as was common for warmth and practicality, would horrify the moral authorities of your time. The human body, even your own, was viewed as a constant source of temptation and sin. Medieval penitentials, those detailed guidebooks for confessors, specifically mentioned the sin of sleeping naked, viewing it as an invitation to impure thoughts and self-gratification. You move to wash your face in the basin of water that sits near your window. The water is cold, almost frozen, and you grimace at its touch. Even this simple reaction is problematic in the medieval mindset. The church taught that physical discomfort should be embraced, that suffering was a path to spiritual purification. Your instinctive recoil from the cold water demonstrates a concerning attachment to bodily comfort. Another small sin to be confessed, that your stomach growls a sound that would have been interpreted as the voice of gluttony calling to you. Church had very specific rules about eating. You were supposed to eat only what was necessary for survival, and any pleasure taken in food was suspect. The sin of gula, gluttony, didn't just mean eating too much. It meant eating too eagerly, too pleasurably, or at the wrong times. Breaking your fast before the appropriate hour was a sin. Eating alone without giving thanks was a sin. Even the way you chewed your food could be sinful if done with too much obvious enjoyment. Imagine yourself preparing your morning meal, perhaps a piece of dark bread and some thin ale, the standard breakfast for common folk. As you tear the bread with your hands, you notice that the piece you've taken is perhaps larger than strictly necessary. The medieval mind would categorize this as a moment of moral failure. The church taught that every grain of wheat was a gift from God, and taking more than your absolute need was a form of theft from the divine storehouse. The ale you drink to wash down your bread presents another moral hazard. While beer and ale were safer than water in medieval times, and even children drank them regularly, the line between necessity and indulgence was razor thin. If you felt even the slightest warming in your chest from the alcohol, If your tone loosened or your mood lifted, you were treading dangerous ground. The sin of ebrietas, drunkenness, began not with falling down intoxication, but with the first moment of altered consciousness. As you eat, your mind wanders. Perhaps you think about the pretty girl who lives 2 houses down, or the handsome young man who helped you carry water yesterday. These thoughts, natural as breathing to us today, were classified as serious sins in the medieval moral system. Any sexual thought about someone to whom you were not married was adultery of the heart. The church taught that even married couples should approach physical intimacy with reluctance and only for the purpose of procreation. To think lustful thoughts about your own spouse, outside of this narrow context, was sinful. Your wandering thoughts might turn to more mundane concerns. Perhaps you're worried about whether you have enough grain to last the winter, or you're planning how to repair a hole in your roof. But even these practical concerns could be sinful if they demonstrated a lack of trust in God's providence. The sin of solicitudo, excessive worry about temporal matters, was believed to show a dangerous lack of faith. You were supposed to trust completely in God's plan, accepting whatever hardship or prosperity came your way without undue concern for the future. You finish a meager breakfast and begin to dress for the day. The very act of caring about your appearance, even in the most basic way, was fraught with moral danger. Vanitas, vanity, wasn't just about elaborate clothing or cosmetics. It was about any concern for how you appeared to others. Spending too much time arranging your hair, choosing which tunic to wear, or making sure your face was clean could all be classified as sinful preoccupation with worldly appearance. As you prepare to leave your home, you might hum a little tune, perhaps a melody you heard at the last village festival. This innocent musical expression would be viewed with deep suspicion by the church authorities. Music that wasn't explicitly religious was often seen as a pathway to sin. Dance music, love songs, or even wordless melodies could stir the passions and lead the soul away from contemplation of divine matters. The sign of cantilena, inappropriate singing, was taken very seriously by medieval moralists. Your tune might attract the attention of your neighbor, who stops to chat as you both begin your morning tasks. This simple social interaction opens up a minefield of potential sins. If you enjoy the conversation too much, you might be guilty of the sin of companionship, taking excessive pleasure in human fellowship instead of focusing on your relationship with God. If you share a piece of gossip about another villager, you commit the sin of detraction. If you complain about the weather, your work, or your circumstances, you demonstrate the sin of murmuratio, inappropriate complaining against God's will. Perhaps your neighbor tells you about a dispute they're having with another villager, and you find yourself taking sides in the conflict. This act of judgment, so natural in human social interaction, was classified as a sin in medieval thinking. You were not supposed to judge others' actions or motivations. That was God's prerogative alone. Even agreeing with someone's criticism of a third party made you complicit in the sin of judgment. The conversation turns to practical matters. The neighbor mentions that the lord of the manor is demanding increased labor service from the villagers. You feel a flash of anger at this news, a perfectly natural reaction to perceived injustice. But this anger, no matter how justified it might seem, was classified as one of the 7 deadly sins. Wrath included not just violent rage, but any feeling of anger toward another person, even a social superior who might be exploiting you. The church taught that all earthly authority came from God, and to feel anger toward those in power was to question the divine order. Your neighbor suggests that perhaps you could find ways to avoid some of your obligations to the Lord, maybe by working more slowly or pretending to be sick on certain days. The mere thought of agreeing to this suggestion would constitute the sin of conspiracy. Even if you never acted on these ideas, entertaining them in your mind was a moral transgression. The church taught that servants should serve their masters with the same devotion they showed to God, and any attempt to evade these duties was a form of spiritual rebellion. As your conversation with your neighbor continues, you both begin to laugh at some shared joke or amusing observation. This laughter, so essential to human happiness and social bonding, was viewed with suspicion by medieval moralists. The sin of rhesus, inappropriate laughter, was believed to demonstrate a lack of proper seriousness about spiritual matters. You were supposed to move through life with gravitas, always mindful of the eternal consequences of your actions. Laughter, especially loud or frequent laughter, suggested a frivolous mind that was not properly focused on the salvation of the soul. Morning sun climbs higher, and you realize you need to begin your daily work. Perhaps you're a farmer, and you need to check on your crops. As you walk through your small plot of land, you feel a sense of pride in the neat rows of vegetables, the healthy-looking grain, the well-maintained fence. This pride, so natural and seemingly innocent, was classified as the sin of superbia, one of the most serious transgressions in the medieval moral system. You are supposed to recognize that any success or prosperity came entirely from God's grace, and to feel personal pride in your achievements was to steal glory that belonged to the divine. Your work requires you to interact with other villagers, perhaps. You need to borrow a tool, or you're working together on a task that requires multiple people. These interactions create countless opportunities for sign. If you work more slowly than your companions, you might be guilty of sloth. If you work more quickly and efficiently, you might be guilty of the sin of pride or of making others look bad. If you give advice about how to do the work better, you might be guilty of the sin of presumption, assuming you know better than others. If you accept advice from others without question, you might be guilty of the sin of servility, failing to use the rational mind that God gave you. The work itself, no matter how necessary or productive, could be sinful if approached with the wrong attitude. If you took pleasure in your labor, enjoying the feeling of your muscles working or the satisfaction of a job well done, you are guilty of taking too much pleasure in worldly activities. If you resented your work, finding it tedious or burdensome, you are guilty of failing to accept God's will for your life. The only appropriate attitude was a kind of neutral acceptance, doing what was necessary without either pleasure or complaint. As the morning progresses, you might find yourself daydreaming while you work. Perhaps you imagine what it would be like to be wealthy, to own more land, to have servants of your own. These fantasies, so common to human nature, were classified as serious sins. The sin of avaritia, greed, included not just the actual accumulation of wealth, but any desire for material improvement in your circumstances. You were supposed to be content with whatever station God had assigned to you, and to dream of advancement was to question the divine plan. Your daydreams might turn to more exotic fantasies. Perhaps you imagine traveling to distant lands, seeing the great cities you've heard about, or meeting famous people. These thoughts, while seemingly innocent, were classified as the sin of curiositas, excessive curiosity about worldly matters. The church taught that your focus should be entirely on spiritual concerns, and any interest in the broader world was a dangerous distraction from the salvation of your soul. The sun reaches its zenith, and you pause in your work to wipe the sweat from your brow. This simple gesture of self-care would be scrutinized by the moral authorities of your time. The act of seeking comfort from physical discomfort, even something as basic as wiping away sweat, could be interpreted as an excessive attachment to bodily ease. The church taught that suffering was a gift from God, a way to purify the soul and identify with Christ's passion. To actively seek relief from even minor discomfort suggested a troubling lack of spiritual discipline. Your stomach begins to rumble again as the midday meal approaches. The timing of your hunger itself could be sinful. If you felt hungry before the designated mealtime, it suggested that you were too focused on bodily needs rather than spiritual ones. The medieval church had specific rules about when food could be consumed, and feeling hungry at the wrong time was evidence of a poorly regulated soul. The ideal Christian was supposed to eat only when necessary for survival, and to feel no pleasure or anticipation about food at all. As you make your way toward your home for the midday meal, you encounter other villagers doing the same. The communal nature of meal times was both a necessity and a spiritual danger. If you enjoyed the company of your fellow villagers too much, you were guilty of excessive attachment to human fellowship. If you preferred to eat alone, you were guilty of antisocial behavior and pride. The church demanded a careful balancing of social interaction to fulfill your Christian duty to community, but not so much that you forgot your primary relationship was with God. Your meal consists of bread, perhaps some cheese if you're fortunate, and vegetables from your garden. The bread, dark and coarse, is the foundation of your diet, but even this simple staple presents moral hazards. If you ate the bread too quickly, you are guilty of gluttony. If you ate it too slowly, savoring each bite, you are equally guilty of taking excessive pleasure in food. The proper Christian ate mechanically, without thought or enjoyment, consuming only what was necessary for survival. The cheese, if you have it, represents a luxury that the church viewed with suspicion. Dairy products were considered more pleasurable than necessary foods like bread and vegetables. Taking enjoyment in the creamy texture or rich taste of cheese was a form of sensual indulgence that drew the soul away from spiritual contemplation. Even if you tried to eat it without pleasure, the very fact that it was more palatable than strictly necessary food made it morally questionable. As you eat, a traveling merchant passes by your window. He calls out, offering to trade exotic spices from distant lands for some of your grain. The mere act of listening to his offer with interest would be sinful. The desire for spices, which served no nutritional purpose, but only made food taste better, was classified as a form of luxury and vanity. Even if you couldn't afford to buy anything from the merchant, the act of wanting these exotic flavors demonstrated an inappropriate attachment to sensual pleasure. Perhaps the merchant also offers colored cloth, or a small mirror, or some other item that would improve your appearance or comfort. Your natural curiosity about these objects, your momentary desire to possess something beautiful or useful, would be catalogued as the sin of cupidity, not just greed for wealth, but any desire for material objects beyond the absolute minimum necessary for survival. The church taught that every moment spent thinking about worldly possessions was a moment stolen from contemplation of God. After your meal, you might feel drowsy, a natural response to eating and the warm midday sun. This drowsiness was viewed as a spiritual danger. The sin of acedia, often translated as sloth, but meaning something more like spiritual lethargy, included any tendency to rest when you should be working or praying. Taking a midday nap, even if you had risen before dawn and worked hard all morning, was seen as evidence of a lazy spirit that preferred physical comfort to spiritual discipline. You force yourself to remain awake and return to your work. Perhaps you're mending a fence, and you take care to make each repair as sturdy and neat as possible. This attention to quality in your work could be interpreted as the sin of pride, taking too much personal satisfaction in your craftsmanship. Alternatively, if you do the work carelessly, just to get it done, you're guilty of sloth and failing to honor God through your labor. The church demanded that you work diligently, but take no personal credit for good work, and feel no frustration about poor work and almost impossible psychological balance. While you work, you might sing to yourself, perhaps a hymn you learned in church, or a work song that helps you keep rhythm. Even religious music could be sinful if you took too much pleasure in your own voice or in the melody itself. The sin of delectatio, taking pleasure in beautiful sounds, applied even to sacred music if the enjoyment was more aesthetic than spiritual. You were supposed to sing psalms and hymns with your mind focused entirely on their religious meaning, not on the beauty of the music itself. If you sang secular songs, work songs, folk melodies, or songs about love and life, you were engaging in much more serious sin. These songs were believed to stir the passions and draw the mind away from God. Love songs, even innocent ones about courtship and marriage, were particularly dangerous because they focused attention on human, rather than divine love. Work songs that helped coordinate group labor were suspect because they made work more pleasurable than it should be. Neighbor approaches and begins to chat while you work. She mentions that she's been having trouble with her husband. He's been drinking too much and coming home angry. Your natural response might be to offer sympathy and perhaps some practical advice. But this innocent act of neighborly kindness opens up multiple possibilities for sin. If you criticize the husband's behavior, you're guilty of judgment. If you take too much interest in your neighbor's private affairs, you're guilty of curiosity about matters that don't concern you. If you offer advice about how to handle the situation, you're guilty of presumption, assuming you know better than she does about her own life. Your neighbor might ask you to keep this information secret, not to tell others about her husband's problems. Agreeing to this request would make you complicit in the sin of secrecy, hiding information that might be relevant to the community or to church authorities. The medieval church was deeply suspicious of private conversations and secret agreements. All aspects of life were supposed to be open to scrutiny by religious authorities, and any attempt to create private spheres of communication was seen as potentially subversive. As you continue your conversation, your neighbor mentions that the priest has been demanding increased tithes from the villagers. You feel a flash of resentment at this news. Your family can barely afford to eat, and giving more to the church seems unreasonable. This resentment, no matter how justified it might, seen from a modern perspective, was classified as one of the most serious sins possible. The church taught that all its demands were divinely inspired, and any resistance or even reluctance to comply was a form of rebellion against God himself. Your neighbor suggests that perhaps the priest is living too luxuriously, spending the community's tithes on fine food and expensive clothing while the villagers struggle to survive. Agreeing with this observation would make you guilty of the sin of detraction criticizing a member of the clergy. The church taught that its representatives were sacred figures, and any criticism of them, no matter how accurate, was a form of blasphemy. Even if you personally witnessed a priest engaging in obviously immoral behavior, you were supposed to accept that God would judge him in due time, and any comment on your part was presumptuous. The conversation turns to lighter topics. Your neighbor mentions that there will be a festival next week to celebrate the harvest. You feel a little surge of excitement at this news. Festivals are rare bright spots in the hard life of a medieval villager. But this excitement itself was morally problematic. The sin of Letitia, excessive joy about worldly pleasures, included any enthusiasm for celebrations, entertainment, or social gatherings. You were supposed to approach even religious festivals with solemn reverence, not with anticipation of enjoyment. Your neighbor describes the dancing that will take place at the festival, and you find yourself looking forward to participating. Dancing was one of the most controversial activities in medieval moral thinking. Some church authorities condemned it entirely as inherently sinful, while others allowed certain types of religious or ceremonial dancing. But any dancing that involved physical pleasure, social interaction between unmarried men and women, or music that stirred the emotions was definitely sinful. The very act of moving your body rhythmically to music was seen as a form of sensual indulgence that could lead to more serious sins. As the afternoon progresses, you complete your work and begin to prepare for the evening. Perhaps you take a few moments to wash your hands and face, cleaning off the dirt and sweat of the day's labor. This attention to cleanliness, while practical, could be interpreted as vanity if you took any pleasure in feeling clean, or if you spent more time on it than absolutely necessary. The church taught that excessive attention to bodily cleanliness was a form of pride and sensual indulgence. You were supposed to be clean enough to be respectable, but not so clean that you took pleasure in your appearance. You might take a moment to look at yourself in a piece of polished metal that serves as a mirror. This act of self-examination was deeply problematic in medieval moral thinking. Looking at your own reflection, even briefly, was classified as vanity. The church taught that you should be so focused on spiritual matters that you had no interest in your physical appearance. Any curiosity about how you looked to others was evidence of pride and worldly attachment. As you prepare to end your workday, you feel a sense of satisfaction about what you've accomplished. You've completed your assigned tasks, your crops are growing well, and you've maintained your property adequately. This feeling of accomplishment, so natural and seemingly healthy, was one of the most dangerous sins in the medieval moral system. The sin of superbia, pride, included any sense of personal achievement or satisfaction with your own work. You were supposed to recognize that any success came entirely from God's grace, and to feel personal pride was to steal glory that belonged to the divine. The sun begins to set, and you prepare to return home for the evening meal. As you walk, you notice the beauty of the sunset, the way the light turns the clouds gold and pink, how the shadows lengthen across the fields. This aesthetic appreciation, this moment of finding beauty in the natural world, was morally suspect. The sin of curiositas included not just curiosity about distant places and people, but any attention to the beauty of the world that was not explicitly directed toward praising God. You were supposed to see the sunset and immediately think of God's glory, not simply enjoy the visual beauty for its own sake. Perhaps you encounter a stray dog on your way home, thin and obviously hungry. Your natural impulse might be to share some of your food with the animal, or at least to feel sympathy for its plight. But this compassion for animals was not necessarily virtuous in medieval thinking. The church taught that humans were fundamentally different from animals, and excessive concern for animal welfare could be seen as a confusion of the natural order. If you fed the dog, you might be guilty of wasting food that could go to humans. If you felt genuine sorrow for the animal's suffering, you might be guilty of misplaced compassion that should be reserved for human souls. As you approach your home, you see your spouse waiting for you. You feel a surge of affection and happiness. At seeing them, perhaps even a stirring of sexual desire. These natural marital feelings were carefully regulated by church doctrine. Excessive love for your spouse was classified as idolatry, putting human love above love for God. Sexual desire, even within marriage, was only acceptable if it was directed toward procreation and was accompanied by reluctance and a sense of duty rather than pleasure. Taking joy in your spouse's company, looking forward to physical intimacy, or feeling romantic love were all potential sins that needed to be confessed and corrected. The evening meal awaits, and with it comes a fresh constellation of potential moral failures. Your spouse has prepared a simple stew, and the aroma fills your small dwelling as you enter. The immediate pleasure you feel at the smell of food cooking is itself a spiritual danger. The church taught that anticipation of eating was a form of gluttony, and that the proper Christian should consume food without any emotional response, positive or negative. The warmth of the hearth, the comfort of being home after a day of labor, the simple pleasure of sitting down to rest, all of these natural human responses to basic comfort were viewed as evidence of excessive attachment to worldly pleasures. Your spouse asks about your day, and you begin to share the small events and encounters that filled your hours. This innocent marital conversation is fraught with moral peril. If you complain about the difficulties you faced, you demonstrate the sin of murmuratio, inappropriate grumbling against God's will. If you express pleasure about positive events, you show excessive attachment to worldly success. If you gossip about your neighbor's affairs, you commit the sin of detraction. If you remain silent, you might be guilty of the sin of taciturnitatis, inappropriate withholding of communication from your spouse. Perhaps you mention your conversation with a neighbor about the priest's demands for increased tithes. Your spouse agrees that the burden seems excessive, given your family's limited resources. This shared criticism of church authority, even if expressed privately between husband and wife, was considered a serious sin. The medieval church was deeply suspicious of private conversations that questioned religious authority, viewing them as potential seeds of heresy. The fact that you and your spouse agree in your criticism only makes it worse. The church taught that married couples should encourage each other toward virtue, not reinforce each other's sinful attitudes. The conversation turns to your children, if you have them. You express concern about your daughter's future. Perhaps you worry about finding her a suitable husband, or you hope that your son will have better opportunities than you've had. These natural parental concerns were classified as the sin of solicitudo, excessive worry about temporal matters. The church taught that parents should be concerned only with their children's spiritual welfare, not their worldly success or happiness. To worry about your daughter's marriage prospects or your son's economic future demonstrated a lack of trust in God's providence and an inappropriate focus on worldly rather than eternal concerns. Your spouse mentions that your daughter has been spending time with a young man from the village, and you feel a mixture of protectiveness and concern. If you disapprove of the relationship, you might be guilty of the sin of judgment, presuming to know what's best for your daughter without trusting in God's plan. If you approve and feel happy about the potential match, you're guilty of taking excessive pleasure in worldly arrangements. The church taught that parents should neither encourage nor discourage their children's romantic interests, but should remain neutral and trust that God would guide events according to his will. Evening meal proceeds, and you find yourself enjoying the taste of the stew more than you should. Perhaps your spouse has managed to obtain some herbs or a small piece of meat that makes the food more flavorful than usual. This enhanced taste, while not sinful in itself, becomes dangerous if you take pleasure in it. The church distinguished between eating for necessity and eating for pleasure, and any enjoyment of food beyond basic sustenance was classified as gluttony. Even if you ate only a small amount, if you savored the taste or felt grateful for the improved flavor, you were guilty of sensual indulgence. After the meal, you might feel drowsy from the food and the warmth of the fire. This natural physiological response was viewed as a spiritual weakness. The sin of acedia, spiritual lethargy, included any tendency toward physical laziness or mental sluggishness. The proper Christian was supposed to remain alert and spiritually active at all times. Ready for prayer and contemplation. To feel sleepy after eating suggested that you are too focused on bodily needs and not sufficiently disciplined in your spiritual life. Your spouse suggests that you both sit by the fire for a while before retiring, perhaps sharing stories or simply enjoying each other's company. This desire for companionship, while natural in marriage, was carefully regulated by church doctrine. The church taught that married couples should interact primarily for the purposes of procreation and mutual spiritual improvement. To seek your spouse's company simply for pleasure or emotional comfort was a form of idolatry, putting human love above love for God. The warmth of the fire, the comfort of shared silence, the simple pleasure of being together, all of these were potential spiritual dangers. Perhaps you tell your spouse a story you heard from a traveling merchant, or share a joke that made you laugh earlier in the day. This innocent entertainment was morally problematic. The church taught that time should be spent in prayer, contemplation, or necessary work, not in frivolous amusement. Storytelling, unless it was explicitly religious in nature, was considered a waste of time that could be better spent in spiritual pursuits. Jokes and humor were particularly suspect because they served no practical purpose and often involved mockery or inappropriate subjects. As the evening progresses, you might take out some needlework or a small craft project to work on by the firelight. This attempt to use your time productively could still be sinful if you took pleasure in the creative process or felt pride in your craftsmanship. The church taught that work should be done purely as a necessity, without any personal satisfaction or artistic enjoyment. If you chose colors or patterns based on aesthetic preference rather than pure functionality, you were guilty of vanity. If you felt pleased with your progress or proud of your skill, you were guilty of pride. Your spouse might suggest that you both practice reading together, perhaps studying a religious text or a book of moral instruction. This attempt at self-improvement, while seemingly virtuous, carried its own risks. If you enjoyed the intellectual challenge of reading, you were guilty of taking excessive pleasure in mental activity. If you felt frustrated by difficult passages, you were guilty of impatience and lack of humility. If you disagreed with or questioned anything you read, you were guilty of pride and presumption. The church taught that lay people should accept religious instruction without question, and any attempt at independent interpretation was dangerous. The topic of reading brings to mind the fact that many of your neighbors cannot read at all, and you might feel a moment of superiority about your own literacy. This sense of being better educated or more capable than others was one of the most serious sins in the medieval moral system. The sign of superba pride included any sense of personal superiority based on abilities, knowledge, or accomplishments. You were supposed to recognize that any talents you possessed were gifts from God, and to feel superior to others because of these gifts was to steal glory that belonged to the divine dot as the fire burns lower. You and your spouse prepare to retire for the night. The very act of going to bed together presented numerous opportunities for sin. If you felt anticipation about potential intimacy, you were guilty of lust. If you felt tired and hoped simply to sleep, you were guilty of sloth. If you performed your evening prayers quickly because you were eager to rest, you were guilty of rushing through your spiritual duties. If you lingered over your prayers because you enjoyed the sense of spiritual devotion, you were guilty of taking pride in your own piety. The church had very specific rules about marital intimacy, and these rules made it almost impossible for married couples to avoid sin in their physical relationship. Sexual activity was only acceptable if it was intended for procreation, performed without pleasure, and accompanied by a sense of duty rather than desire. If you initiated intimacy, you were guilty of lust. If you responded enthusiastically to your spouse's advances, you were equally guilty. If you took any pleasure in the physical act, you were guilty of sensual indulgence. If you felt emotionally close to your spouse during intimacy, you were guilty of placing human love above divine love. Even the absence of sexual activity carried moral risks. If you avoided intimacy because you found it unpleasant, you were guilty of failing in your marital duties. If you avoided it because you wanted to maintain spiritual purity, you were guilty of pride and of making yourself holier than God intended married people to be. The church taught that married couples had obligations to each other, and excessive spiritual zeal that interfered with these obligations was itself a form of sin. As you lie in bed, Your mind might wander over the events of the day. Perhaps you think about tasks you need to complete tomorrow, or you worry about problems that need to be solved. These natural mental processes were classified as sins if they interfered with your focus on spiritual matters. The church taught that the time before sleep should be spent in prayer and examination of conscience, not in planning or worry about worldly affairs. Any thoughts about practical matters, no matter how necessary, were inappropriate during this sacred time. Your examination of conscience, if you performed it properly, would reveal the stunning accumulation of sins from just one ordinary day. The morning's oversleeping, the pleasure taken in food and drink, the anger felt toward authority figures, the pride in your work, the vanity in your appearance, the gossip shared with neighbors, the excessive love for your spouse, the worry about your children's future. All of these natural human responses to daily life were cataloged as moral. Failures requiring confession and penance. The weight of this constant moral scrutiny was overwhelming. Every thought, every feeling, every action was subject to analysis and judgment. The medieval Christian lived in a state of perpetual spiritual anxiety, knowing that even the most innocent activities could be sinful if approached with the wrong attitude. The church's penitential system offered forgiveness, but it also reinforced the message that ordinary human nature was fundamentally corrupt, and that salvation required constant vigilance against the temptations of daily life. As you finally drift toward sleep, even this natural biological function carried moral implications. If you fell asleep quickly, you might be guilty of sloth, failing to spend adequate time in prayer and spiritual reflection. If you lay awake thinking, you were guilty of allowing worldly concerns to interfere with rest that was necessary for the next day's work. The church taught that sleep should be neither avoided nor embraced, but accepted as a necessary evil that should be approached with the same neutral attitude as eating or working. Your dreams themselves were not exempt from moral scrutiny. The church taught that dreams could be messages from God, temptations from the devil, or products of an undisciplined mind. If you had pleasant dreams, you were guilty of taking pleasure in illusions. If you had frightening dreams, you were guilty of allowing evil influences into your mind. If you had sexual dreams, you were guilty of lust even in sleep. The medieval Christian was never truly free from the possibility of sin, not even in the unconscious hours of the night. The day that began with the simple act of waking up ended with the equally simple act of falling asleep, and yet both bookends of ordinary life were fraught with moral danger. The accumulated weight of a day's worth of minor sins, the small pleasures, the natural emotions, the innocent social interactions, created a burden of guilt that required constant attention and regular confession. The medieval world was one where human nature itself was seen as inherently sinful, and where the most basic activities of daily life were transformed into spiritual challenges that few could navigate without moral failure. From the everyday sins of common folk, we turn now to a more extraordinary case, a woman whose profound spiritual insights and mystical experiences led her not to salvation, but to the flames of the Inquisition. Marguerite Porete was a French mystic who lived in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, a time when the Church's paranoia about heresy had reached fever pitch. Her story illuminates how even the most sincere and devout spiritual seeking could be transformed into deadly sin by the theological and political machinery of medieval Christianity. Marguerite was born around 1250 in Hainaut, a region that is now part of Belgium and northern France. This was a time of great religious ferment, when new spiritual movements were emerging across Europe, challenging traditional forms of religious authority and expression. The rise of mendicant orders, like the Franciscans and Dominicans, had legitimized poverty and spiritual seeking outside traditional monastic structures. But it had also created anxiety among church authorities about who could claim religious authority and what forms of spiritual expression were acceptable. Little is known about Marguerite's early life, but she appears to have been well educated and likely came from a family of some means. The ability to read and write was relatively rare among women of her time, and the sophistication of her theological writing suggests that she had access to religious education that was typically reserved for the clergy. This education itself would have marked her as unusual and potentially dangerous in the eyes of church authorities, who were deeply suspicious of learned women who presumed to write about theological matters. Sometime in the 1290s, Marguerite wrote a book titled The Mirror of Simple Souls, a mystical treatise that would ultimately cost her her life. The book was written in Old French rather than Latin, making it accessible to ordinary people rather than restricting it to the scholarly clergy. This choice of language was itself a revolutionary act, suggesting that profound spiritual truths could be understood by common believers without the mediation of church hierarchy. The very act of writing in the vernacular was seen as presumptuous and potentially heretical. The central theme of Marguerite's book was the concept of the annihilated soul, the idea that through perfect love of God, the human soul could become so completely united with the divine will that it transcended the need for conventional religious observances. She wrote about a state of spiritual perfection in which the soul became so absorbed in God that it no longer needed to follow traditional religious practices or worry about sin. This was an intoxicating and dangerous idea that struck at the heart of the Church's institutional authority. According to Marguerite's mystical theology, the simple soul that achieved perfect union with God was freed from the constraints of ordinary morality. She wrote that such a soul takes leave of virtues because it had moved beyond the need for deliberate acts of goodness. Its will had become so perfectly aligned with God's will that it could not sin, even if it appeared to transgress conventional moral boundaries. This concept of spiritual freedom was profoundly threatening to church authorities, who depended on the idea that all Christians needed constant guidance and supervision from the clergy. Marguerite's mystical experiences, as described in her book, involved a direct, unmediated relationship with God that bypassed the Church's sacramental system. She wrote about conversations with divine love personified, describing intimate spiritual encounters that suggested she had achieved a level of spiritual perfection that most theologians believed was impossible in this life. Her writing was filled with erotic imagery, describing the soul's relationship with God in terms that echoed the passionate love between human lovers. This use of sexual metaphors for spiritual experience was not uncommon in medieval mystical literature, but Marguerite's version was particularly explicit and bold. The dangerous implications of Marguerite's theology were not lost on church authorities. If ordinary believers could achieve direct union with God through love alone, what need was there for priests, sacraments, or church guidance? If the perfected soul was beyond sin, what need was there for confession, penance, or the elaborate moral system that the Church had constructed? Marguerite's mystical theology, taken to its logical conclusion, suggested that the institutional Church was at best unnecessary, and at worst an obstacle to true spiritual development. The first official action against Marguerite's book came around 1296, when Guy II, Bishop of Cambrai, ordered it to be burned publicly and forbade her from circulating it further. This public burning of her work was intended not just to destroy the dangerous ideas it contained, but to humiliate Marguerite and serve as a warning to others who might be tempted to write similar works. The spectacle of book burning was designed to demonstrate the Church's power to control religious discourse and to show what happened to those who dared to challenge orthodox theological boundaries. Marguerite's response to this censure reveals both her spiritual conviction and her fatal inability to understand the political realities of her situation. Rather than submitting to church authority and abandoning her theological writings, she continued to circulate copies of her book and to teach her mystical doctrines to anyone who would listen. She seems to have believed that the truth of her spiritual insights would ultimately be recognized, and that church authorities would eventually understand that her teachings were not heretical, but represented a higher form of Christian spirituality. This continued defiance of episcopal authority was seen as evidence of Marguerite's pride and stubbornness. The medieval church expected complete submission from lay people, especially women, who were considered particularly susceptible to spiritual delusion and demonic influence. Marguerite's insistence on the validity of her mystical experiences and her refusal to abandon her theological writings were interpreted as signs of the spiritual pride that the church considered one of the most dangerous sins. In 1306, Philippe de Marigny, the new bishop of Cambrai, issued a second condemnation of Marguerite's work and threatened her with excommunication if she continued to teach her doctrines. This escalation of church pressure reflected growing concern about the spread of Marguerite's ideas and the potential for her mystical theology to inspire broader resistance to clerical authority. The threat of excommunication was particularly serious because it would have cut Marguerite off from all sacraments and made her a social outcast. But even this extreme measure failed to silence her. Marguerite's continued teaching and writing brought her to the attention of William of Paris, the Dominican inquisitor who had been appointed to root out heresy in northern France. William was a seasoned professional in the business of identifying and prosecuting religious dissent, and he recognized immediately that Marguerite's mystical theology represented a sophisticated challenge to Orthodox Christianity. Unlike many of the simple folk who were accused of heresy for their ignorance or superstition, Marguerite was clearly an intelligent and educated woman, whose theological errors were all the more dangerous because of their intellectual sophistication. Inquisition's investigation of Marguerite revealed that her influence had spread far beyond her immediate circle. Copies of her book were circulating among religious communities across northern Europe, and her ideas about the annihilated soul and spiritual freedom were being discussed in convents, beguinages, and other centers of female religiosity. The church authorities were particularly concerned about the appeal of Marguerite's ideas to religious women, who were already viewed with suspicion because of their tendency toward emotional and mystical forms of spirituality. The theological examination of Marguerite's work was conducted by a panel of experts from the University of Paris, the most prestigious theological institution in Europe. These scholars subjected her writing to minute analysis, identifying passages that could be interpreted as heretical, and constructing a systematic case against her mystical theology. The academic nature of this process gave the eventual condemnation an air of scholarly authority, but it also revealed how theological speculation that was tolerated when practiced by male clerics could become deadly heresy when expressed by a laywoman. The specific charges against Marguerite centered on her claims about the spiritual freedom of the annihilated soul. The theologians argued that her teaching about souls being freed from virtue and conventional morality could lead to antinomianism, the odd belief that those who had achieved spiritual perfection were no longer bound by moral law. They pointed to passages in her book that seemed to suggest that the perfected soul could engage in any behavior without sin, because its will had become identical with God's will. Marguerite's defenders, and there were some even among the clergy, argued that her mystical language was metaphorical, and that she was describing a state of spiritual maturity in which virtue became so natural that it no longer required conscious effort. They contended that her references to being freed from virtue meant only that the advanced soul no longer struggled with temptation, not that it was free to commit actual sins. But these subtle theological distinctions were lost in the political and social anxieties that surrounded the case. The trial proceedings reveal the profound disconnect between Marguerite's mystical understanding of Christianity and the institutional church's need for doctrinal control. When questioned by the inquisitors, Marguerite consistently refused to recant her teachings or to acknowledge that her mystical experiences might have been delusional. She maintained that her insights into divine love were genuine revelations that came directly from God, and she expressed bewilderment that church authorities could not recognize the truth of her spiritual experiences. This refusal to submit to church authority was interpreted as evidence of the spiritual pride that theologians considered the root of all heresy. The inquisitors argued that Marguerite's insistence on the validity of her private revelations demonstrated a dangerous independence of mind that threatened the very foundations of ecclesiastical authority. Her claim to have achieved direct union with God was seen as presumptuous and blasphemous, suggesting that she considered herself equal to the saints and mystics whose experiences the Church had officially recognized. The theological implications of Marguerite's mystical writings ran far deeper than simple disobedience to church authority. Her concept of the annihilated soul represented a fundamental challenge to the entire medieval understanding of sin, redemption, and the role of the institutional church in human salvation. To understand why her ideas were considered so dangerous, we must examine the specific ways in which her mystical theology contradicted Orthodox Christian doctrine and threatened the very foundations of medieval religious society. At the heart of Marguerite's mystical system was the idea that the human soul could achieve such perfect union with God that it transcended the ordinary categories of good and evil. She wrote about 7 stages of spiritual development, with the highest stages involving a complete dissolution of the individual will into the divine will. In this state of perfect union, she claimed, the soul became incapable of sin because it could will nothing that was contrary to God's will. This was not merely a state of moral perfection, but a transformation so complete that the ordinary rules of ethics and morality no longer applied. This concept struck at the heart of the Church's understanding of human nature and the necessity of constant moral vigilance. The Orthodox teaching held that all humans, no matter how spiritually advanced, remain susceptible to sin throughout their earthly lives. Even the greatest saints were believed to struggle with temptation and to require constant grace and guidance from the Church to maintain their spiritual standing. Marguerite's claim that the annihilated soul was beyond sin suggested that human beings could achieve a state of perfection that the Church reserved for the afterlife. The political implications of this theology were enormous. If ordinary believers could achieve direct union with God and transcend the need for conventional morality, what role was left for the priesthood, the sacraments, and the elaborate system of confession and penance that formed the backbone of medieval religious life? Marguerite's mystical theology suggested that the highest form of Christian spirituality involved moving beyond the need for institutional religious guidance, a proposition that threatened the very existence of the clerical establishment. Her use of erotic imagery to describe the soul's relationship with God was particularly troubling to Church authorities. Marguerite wrote about the soul being naked before God, stripped of all will and desire except the desire for union with the divine. She described this spiritual nakedness in terms that were unmistakably sexual, using language of penetration, surrender, and ecstatic fulfillment that paralleled the most intimate human relationships. This mystical eroticism was not entirely unprecedented in Christian literature. Mystics, like Bernard of Clairvaux, had used similar imagery, but Marguerite's version was more explicit and more central to her theological system. The Church's discomfort with mystical eroticism reflected deep anxieties about the relationship between spiritual and sexual experience. Medieval theology held that sexual desire was one of the most dangerous forms of concupiscence, a constant threat to spiritual purity that needed to be carefully controlled and channeled. The idea that sexual imagery could be used to describe the highest forms of spiritual experience suggested that the boundary between sacred and profane love was more permeable than Orthodox theology allowed. Marguerite's descriptions of spiritual ecstasy often used language that was indistinguishable from descriptions of sexual climax. She wrote about the soul being ravished by divine love, about being taken by God in moments of overwhelming spiritual intensity, about the sweet pain of union with the divine that left the soul transformed and exhausted. This mystical vocabulary was deeply unsettling to Church authorities, who worried that such language might encourage readers to confuse spiritual and sexual experience, or worse, to use religious language as a cover for actual sexual indulgence. The concept of spiritual freedom that Marguerite advocated was perhaps the most dangerous aspect of her theology. She taught that the annihilated soul, having achieved perfect union with God, was freed from the need to follow conventional religious practices. Such a soul no longer needed to pray in traditional ways, to follow liturgical schedules, to participate in communal worship, or to seek guidance from priests. Instead, it lived in constant prayer and union with God, finding the divine presence in every moment and every activity. This spiritual antinomianism, the belief that those who had achieved spiritual perfection were above moral law, was one of the most feared heresies in medieval Christianity. Church authorities had seen how similar ideas had been used to justify all kinds of moral transgressions, from sexual license to violent rebellion against social order. The history of Christian heresy was filled with groups who claimed that their spiritual advancement freed them from conventional morality, and these movements had often ended in social chaos and violent suppression. Marguerite's teaching about being freed from virtue was particularly problematic because it seemed to suggest that traditional Christian virtues like humility, chastity, and obedience were obstacles to spiritual advancement rather than pathways to it. She wrote that the annihilated soul had moved beyond the need for deliberate acts of virtue because its will had become so perfectly aligned with God's will that virtue was automatic and unconscious. This teaching implied that the entire system of moral instruction and spiritual discipline that the Church had developed was not only unnecessary for advanced souls, but might actually be harmful to their spiritual development. The social implications of Marguerite's theology were equally troubling to church and secular authorities. If the highest form of Christian spirituality involved transcending conventional moral categories, what happened to the social order that depended on shared moral standards? How could society function if individuals claimed the right to determine their own moral obligations based on their private spiritual experiences? The medieval world was built on the assumption that moral and social order were divinely ordained, and that individual conscience needed to be subordinated to communal authority. Marguerite's ideas were particularly appealing to religious women, who found in her mystical theology a validation of their own spiritual experiences and a justification for religious autonomy that was otherwise denied to them. The Beguines, semi-religious women who lived in communities dedicated to prayer and service, but who were not bound by formal monastic vows, were especially drawn to Marguerite's teachings about spiritual freedom and direct union with God. These women had already challenged conventional expectations about female religious life, and Marguerite's theology provided them with a sophisticated theological framework for their unconventional spiritual practices. The appeal of Marguerite's ideas to religious women was seen by church authorities as evidence of the dangerous tendency of women toward spiritual delusion and heretical thinking. Medieval theology held that women were more susceptible than men to demonic influence and spiritual pride, and that their emotional and intuitive approach to religion made them particularly vulnerable to mystical delusions. The fact that Marguerite's teachings resonated with communities of religious women was taken as proof of their heretical nature rather than their spiritual value. The theological experts who examined Marguerite's writings identified numerous specific passages that they considered heretical. They pointed to her claim that the annihilated soul gives no thought to herself nor to God, but only to that which God wills, and she cannot will except that which God wills. This statement seemed to suggest that the perfected soul became identical with God, a form of pantheistic mysticism that Orthodox theology rejected as blasphemous. The distinction between creator and creature was fundamental to Christian doctrine, and any suggestion that humans could achieve true identity with God was considered heretical. Another problematic passage in Marguerite's work stated that the freed soul has no care for shame or honor, for poverty or riches, for ease or anguish, for love or hate, for hell or paradise. This teaching seemed to suggest that the spiritually advanced person became indifferent to moral distinctions and eternal consequences, a form of spiritual nihilism that threatened the very foundations of Christian ethics. If the perfected soul was equally indifferent to heaven and hell, what motivation remained for moral behavior or spiritual striving? The inquisitors were particularly concerned about Marguerite's teaching that the annihilated soul takes leave of virtues and does not ask for anything from God. This seemed to contradict fundamental Christian teachings about the importance of prayer, petition, and ongoing relationship with the divine. Orthodox theology held that even the most advanced Christians needed to maintain active spiritual practices and to continue seeking God's grace throughout their lives. Marguerite's suggestion that the perfected soul moved beyond the need for traditional spiritual practices struck at the heart of the Church's institutional role in mediating between humans and God. The trial records reveal that Marguerite was offered multiple opportunities to recant her teachings and submit to church authority. The inquisitors explained carefully why her ideas were considered heretical and gave her detailed instruction in Orthodox theology. They offered her the chance to acknowledge her errors and to accept the Church's guidance in correcting her spiritual understanding. This process of attempted correction was standard in Inquisition proceedings and reflected the Church's official preference for rehabilitation over punishment. Marguerite's consistent refusal to recant was interpreted not as principled adherence to spiritual truth, but as evidence of the spiritual pride and obstinacy that characterized confirmed heretics. Her insistence that her mystical experiences were genuine divine revelations, and her inability to see how they contradicted Orthodox teaching were taken as proof that she had fallen victim to demonic delusion. The inquisitors concluded that her mind had been so corrupted by heretical ideas that she was no longer capable of recognizing religious truth. The theological condemnation of Marguerite's work involved a careful parsing of her mystical language to identify statements that could be interpreted as heretical. The experts acknowledged that much of her writing could be read in an orthodox sense if interpreted metaphorically, or with appropriate qualifications. However, they argued that the dangerous passages outweighed the acceptable ones, and that the overall effect of her work was to encourage spiritual pride and antinomian thinking among readers, who lacked the theological sophistication to distinguish between legitimate mystical experience and heretical delusion. The case against Marguerite was strengthened by testimony from former followers who had come to reject her teachings. These witnesses described how Marguerite's ideas about spiritual freedom had led them to neglect traditional religious practices and to justify moral transgressions by claiming spiritual perfection. Their testimony painted a picture of a religious teacher whose mystical theology had practical consequences that undermined Christian morality and social order. The political context of Marguerite's trial was also crucial to its outcome. The early 14th century was a time of intense anxiety about heretical movements and social rebellion throughout Europe. The Church was still dealing with the aftermath of various mystical and reformist movements that had challenged ecclesiastical authority, and there was deep concern about the potential for religious dissent to inspire broader social upheaval. Marguerite's case was seen not just as an individual theological error, but as part of a broader pattern of dangerous thinking that threatened the stability of Christian society. The involvement of King Philip IV of France in Marguerite's prosecution reflected the political dimensions of the case. The French monarchy had its own reasons for supporting the Church's campaign against heresy, as religious dissent often provided a cover for political rebellion. The king's cooperation with the Inquisition in Marguerite's case was part of a broader alliance between secular and religious authorities, aimed at maintaining social and political order through theological orthodoxy. The final phase of Marguerite Porret's life unfolded with the inexorable logic of medieval justice, where theological error was not merely an intellectual mistake, but a corruption of the soul that threatened the very fabric of Christian society. By 1308, after years of investigation and attempted correction, the Inquisition had concluded that Marguerite was a relapsed heretic whose continued existence posed an unacceptable danger to the faith of ordinary believers. The machinery of ecclesiastical justice began to move toward its inevitable conclusion, grinding forward with the measured deliberation that characterized all official church proceedings. The formal trial proceedings reveal the careful attention to legal procedure that characterized Inquisition cases, even when the outcome seemed predetermined. Marguerite was provided with legal counsel, though her appointed advocates were constrained by the requirement that they could not defend obviously heretical positions. The transcript of her interrogations shows a woman who remained convinced of the truth of her mystical experiences, even as the legal net tightened around her. When asked directly whether she would submit to the judgment of the Church and renounce her teachings, she responded with statements that the inquisitors interpreted as evidence of her complete spiritual corruption. Her responses during the trial reveal a profound disconnect between her understanding of religious authority and that of her judges. When pressed to acknowledge the Church's right to judge her spiritual experiences, Marguerite reportedly replied that she recognized no authority higher than God himself, and that her mystical union with the divine gave her direct access to religious truth that could not be mediated or corrected by human institutions. This position, while perhaps reflecting genuine mystical conviction, was interpreted by the court as evidence of the spiritual pride that theologians considered the most dangerous of all heresies. The trial proceedings were complicated by the question of Marguerite's mental competence. Some observers suggested that her mystical experiences might have driven her to madness, and that she should be treated as a person suffering from mental illness rather than as a deliberate heretic. However, the sophistication of her theological writings and the coherence of her responses during interrogation convinced the inquisitors that she was fully rational and therefore fully responsible for her heretical beliefs. The medieval legal system had little patience for claims of diminished responsibility, particularly in cases involving challenges to religious authority. The theological examination of Marguerite's case involved some of the most distinguished scholars of the University of Paris, including masters of theology, who were considered among the leading intellectual lights of their generation. These men approached her mystical writings with the analytical tools of scholastic theology, subjecting every passage to careful logical analysis and comparison with established orthodox doctrine. Their final report, identified 15 specific propositions from her work that they deemed heretical, each one carefully documented and explained in the formal language of academic theology. The condemned propositions revealed the breadth of Marguerite's challenge to Orthodox Christianity. Her teaching that the annihilated soul gives no more thought to God than to a piece of wood was condemned as blasphemous indifference to the divine. Her claim that such a soul takes no account of the good deeds or evil deeds of others was rejected as dangerous moral relativism. Her assertion that the freed soul cannot sin was condemned as a denial of human fallibility that contradicted fundamental Christian anthropology. Each condemned proposition was accompanied by detailed theological analysis explaining why it was incompatible with Orthodox faith. The involvement of secular authorities in Marguerite's case reflected the complex relationship between religious and political power in medieval France. King Philip IV, known to history as Philip the Fair, had his own complicated relationship with the papacy and was not always deferential to church authority. However, in the case of heresy trials, the king generally supported the Inquisition because religious dissent often provided a cover for political rebellion. The royal court's cooperation with church authorities in Marguerite's prosecution was part of a broader pattern of collaboration between secular and religious power in maintaining social order. The legal process by which Marguerite was condemned reveals the careful attention to procedural correctness that characterized Inquisition trials. She was formally accused, given opportunities to respond to the charges against her, provided with legal counsel, and offered multiple chances to recant her errors. The court records show that the inquisitors followed established procedures for determining heresy and that they gave her every opportunity that the law required to save herself through submission to church authority. From the perspective of medieval legal thinking, the trial was conducted with scrupulous attention to due process. Marguerite's final refusal to recant was made in the presence of a carefully assembled audience that included representatives of the University of Paris, members of the royal court, and various church officials. This public setting was intended to demonstrate the official nature of her condemnation and to serve as a warning to others who might be tempted to follow her. Example: her final statement, as recorded by court scribes, reportedly reaffirmed her belief in the truth of her mystical experiences and her conviction that the church authorities did not understand the nature of true spiritual union with God. The decision to execute Marguerite rather than impose a lesser penalty reflected the seriousness with which church authorities viewed her case. Many heretics who recanted their errors were sentenced to penances, imprisonment, or other punishments short of death. However, Marguerite's status as a relapsed heretic, someone who had been previously warned and had continued to teach condemned doctrines, made her eligible for the ultimate penalty under canon law. Her continued defiance after formal condemnation was interpreted as evidence that she was beyond redemption and posed a continuing danger to the faith of others. The preparations for Marguerite's execution followed the established protocols for dealing with condemned heretics. She was formally relaxed to the secular authorities, a legal fiction that allowed the church to maintain that it did not shed blood while ensuring that the death penalty was carried out. The secular authorities were required by law to execute condemned heretics, and failure to do so could result in their own excommunication and prosecution. This system allowed the church to eliminate theological dissidents while maintaining the pretense that it was not directly responsible for their deaths. The public nature of Marguerite's execution was central to its purpose as a deterrent to others. Medieval executions were theatrical events designed to demonstrate the power of authority and the consequences of challenging established order. The crowd that gathered to witness Marguerite's death would have included not only curious spectators, but also religious women who might have been influenced by her teachings. The spectacle of her burning was intended to serve as a vivid reminder of what happened to those who presumed to challenge church authority. Contemporary accounts of Marguerite's execution describe her behavior at the stake in terms that reveal the complex emotions surrounding her death. Some witnesses reported that she maintained her composure and continued to assert the truth of her mystical experiences, even as the flames began to consume her. Others suggested that she showed signs of fear or doubt in her final moments. These contradictory accounts reflect the political and theological biases of the observers, as well as the human tendency to seek confirmation of one's own beliefs in ambiguous situations. The aftermath of Marguerite's execution reveals the limited effectiveness of such extreme measures in suppressing dangerous ideas. Despite the public nature of her condemnation and death, copies of The Mirror of Simple Souls continued to circulate throughout Europe for centuries. The book was translated into Latin, Middle English, and Italian, reaching audiences far beyond the original French-speaking readership. Ironically, the Church's violent suppression of Marguerite's teachings may have contributed to their preservation and dissemination by creating a sense that they contained forbidden truths. The survival of Marguerite's writings in various forms demonstrates the resilience of mystical traditions, even in the face of official persecution. Religious communities, particularly those of women, continued to find value in her descriptions of spiritual union and divine love, even when they could not openly acknowledge the source of these ideas. The themes that Marguerite had explored: the possibility of direct union with God, the transcendence of conventional morality through spiritual perfection, the inadequacy of institutional religion for the most advanced souls, continued to resurface in various forms throughout the later medieval and early modern periods. The theological legacy of Marguerite's case extended far beyond her individual fate. Her condemnation established important precedents for how the Church would deal with mystical claims that seemed to challenge institutional authority. The specific charges brought against her and the theological reasoning used to justify her execution became part of the standard toolkit that inquisitors would use in evaluating other cases of suspected mystical heresy. Her case helped to define the boundaries of acceptable mystical experience and to establish the principle that all claims to direct divine revelation must be subject to Church approval. The political implications of Marguerite's execution were equally significant. Her case demonstrated the willingness of both religious and secular authorities to use extreme measures to suppress theological dissent. The cooperation between the Inquisition and the French royal court in securing her condemnation established a model for church-state collaboration in maintaining orthodox belief that would be repeated in numerous later cases. The precedents set by her execution would influence how authorities dealt with religious dissidents for generations to come. The social impact of Marguerite's death was particularly pronounced among communities of religious women who had found in her teachings a validation of their own spiritual aspirations and a theological framework for religious autonomy. Her execution served as a stark reminder of the dangers faced by women who presumed to write about theological matters or to claim direct access to divine truth. The message was clear. Women's spiritual experiences were acceptable only when they remained private and submitted to male ecclesiastical authority. The psychological effect of Marguerite's execution on those who had been influenced by her teachings was profound and lasting. Many of her followers were forced to choose between their conviction that her mystical insights were genuine and their desire to avoid the fate that had befallen their teacher. Some publicly renounced their association with her teachings, while privately maintaining their belief in their truth. Others abandoned their mystical practices entirely, convinced that the official condemnation meant that their spiritual experiences had been delusions or demonic deceptions. The intellectual legacy of Marguerite's case extended beyond the immediate sphere of mystical theology to influence broader questions about the relationship between individual conscience and institutional authority. Her insistence that her direct experience of divine truth gave her the right to judge church teachings raised fundamental questions about the source and nature of religious knowledge that would continue to trouble Christian thinkers for centuries. The tension between personal spiritual experience and institutional religious authority that her case exemplified would resurface repeatedly in various forms throughout the history of Christianity. The documentation surrounding Marguerite's trial and execution provides valuable insight into the medieval Church's understanding of the relationship between orthodox belief and social order. The careful attention paid to the theological implications of her mystical teachings reflects a sophisticated understanding of how religious ideas could influence social and political stability. The authorities clearly recognized that Marguerite's challenge to conventional religious practice could have far-reaching consequences beyond the realm of pure theology. The international dimensions of Marguerite's case reveal the extent to which the medieval Church functioned as a transnational institution with shared standards and procedures for dealing with heresy. The theological experts who condemned her teachings included scholars from various European universities, and the precedents established by her case would influence Inquisition proceedings throughout Europe. Her execution was not simply a local French affair, but part of a broader European campaign to maintain theological orthodoxy and institutional authority. On June 1, 1310, in the Place de Grève in Paris, Marguerite Porete was burned at the stake for the crime of heresy. The flames that consumed her body were intended to purify the community of her dangerous ideas and to serve as a warning to others who might be tempted to challenge church authority. Yet the fire that was meant to silence her voice ultimately helped to preserve her memory, creating a martyr whose story would inspire generations of mystics and religious dissidents. In death, she achieved a kind of immortality that her mystical writings had promised, but that the medieval church had determined she could never possess in life. From the dramatic flames that consumed Marguerite Porete, we turn now to examine the meticulous bureaucracy of sin that made such executions possible. Hidden in the archives of medieval monasteries and cathedrals, preserved in manuscripts that few modern eyes have seen, lie the penitential table's extraordinary documents that reveal the medieval church's obsessive attention to cataloging every conceivable human transgression. These texts, written by learned clerics and copied by scribes across centuries, represent one of the most comprehensive attempts in human history to map the territory of moral failure and spiritual corruption. A penitential tradition began in the early medieval period, emerging from the Irish and Anglo-Saxon churches, where monks developed elaborate systems for classifying sins and prescribing appropriate penances. By the high medieval period, these simple lists had evolved into sophisticated theological treatises that dissected human behavior with the precision of anatomists examining a corpse. Every gesture, every thought, every moment of pleasure or pain was subject to moral analysis and potential condemnation. The physical manuscripts themselves are fascinating artifacts that reveal the institutional importance of sin classification in medieval religious life. Many are written in elegant Gothic script on expensive parchment, illuminated with elaborate marginal decorations that transform lists of human transgressions into works of art. The care lavished on these documents reflects their crucial role in the medieval church's mission to regulate human behavior and maintain spiritual order. These were not academic exercises, but practical manuals used by confessors to ensure that no sin escaped detection and punishment. One of the most comprehensive surviving penitentials is the Summa de Poenitentia, compiled by Raymond of Penyafort in the 13th century. This massive work, running to hundreds of pages in modern editions, attempts to catalog every possible sin and prescribe exact penances for each transgression. The level of detail is staggering. Raymond and his collaborators considered scenarios that most modern readers would find either trivial or incomprehensible as moral issues. Their work reveals a worldview in which no aspect of human existence was too minor to escape theological scrutiny. The organization of these penitential tables follows a logical hierarchy that reflects medieval theological understanding of the relative gravity of different sins. At the top are the mortal sins that damn the soul: murder, adultery, apostasy, and other grave transgressions that cut the sinner off from God's grace. Below these are the venial sins that wound the soul without, destroying it entirely: small lies, moments of anger, minor acts of vanity or pride. But even this basic distinction becomes complicated when the penitentials attempt to categorize the endless variety of human behavior and motivation. The sexual transgressions cataloged in medieval penitentials reveal the church's deep anxiety about bodily pleasure and its potential to corrupt the soul. The lists are exhaustive and explicit, covering not only obvious sins like adultery and fornication, but also elaborate variations and circumstantial factors that modern readers might find bizarre or incomprehensible. The penitentials distinguish between different positions for sexual intercourse, different times of day or year when sexual activity might occur, different emotional states that might accompany physical intimacy, and different categories of people who might engage in sexual behavior. Sleeping naked, as we discovered in our exploration of daily life, appears in numerous penitential tables as a specific category of sin requiring confession and penance. The manuscripts provide detailed discussions of the circumstances that might make this transgression more or less serious. Sleeping naked alone was considered less serious then sleeping naked with one spouse, which was in turn less serious, then sleeping naked in circumstances where others might see. The penitentials even consider factors like the temperature of the night, the availability of clothing, and the sleeper's intention in determining the appropriate penance. The tables reveal an almost obsessive attention to the details of eating and drinking that would have made normal medieval life a constant navigation through moral hazards. Different types of food carried different levels of moral risk. Meat was more dangerous than vegetables, spiced food more dangerous than plain, imported food more dangerous than local. But beyond these general categories, the penitentials considered dozens of specific factors: the time of day when eating occurred, the speed with which food was consumed, the company in which meals were shared, the gratitude expressed before and after eating, the thoughts that occupied the mind while chewing. Laughing appears in the penitential tables as a surprisingly complex category of transgression. The manuscripts distinguish between different types of laughter: gentle amusement versus loud guffawing, solitary chuckling versus group hilarity, laughter at appropriate subjects versus laughter at inappropriate ones. They consider the time and place where laughter occurs, the social status of those involved, the underlying causes of the amusement, and the effects of the laughter on observers. Even the physical aspects of laughter, the facial expressions, the bodily movements, the sounds produced, are subject to moral analysis. The treatment of music in medieval penitentials reveals the Church's ambivalent relationship with artistic beauty and its power to move the human soul. Singing is carefully categorized according to multiple criteria: the content of the songs, the occasion for singing, the skill of the performer, the pleasure taken by both singer and audience, the instruments used for accompaniment, and the social setting in which the music occurs. Even humming is addressed, with distinctions made between wordless melodies and specific tunes, between conscious and unconscious musical expression. Dancing receives even more detailed attention, reflecting the Church's deep suspicion of rhythmic bodily movement and its potential to stir dangerous passions. The penitentials catalog different types of dance: solo versus partnered, religious versus secular, slow versus fast, simple versus elaborate. They consider the clothing worn while dancing, the music that accompanies the movement, the emotions expressed through dance, the audience present during the performance, and the intentions of the dancers. Even involuntary rhythmic movement, tapping feet, swaying to music, nodding to a beat, falls under scrutiny. The manuscripts reveal fascinating regional variations in how different sins were understood and penalized. What might be considered a minor transgression in one diocese could be treated as a serious moral failure in another. These differences reflect not only varying local customs, but also different theological emphases among the scholars who compiled the penitentials. Some regions were particularly strict about sexual transgressions, others about economic sins, still others about social hierarchies and proper deference to authority. The penitentials' treatment of economic behavior reveals the medieval Church's complex relationship with commerce and material prosperity. Every aspect of buying and selling is subject to moral analysis: the prices charged, the quality of goods offered, the honesty of descriptions, the motives for engaging in trade, the use made of profits, the treatment of customers and competitors. Even seemingly innocent activities like saving money, planning for the future, or taking pleasure in successful bargaining are classified as potential sins requiring confession. Work itself becomes a moral minefield in the penitential tables. The manuscripts consider not only what work is performed, but how it is approached, with what attitude, for what motives, with what level of skill and attention. Taking too much pleasure in work is sinful, but so is performing work carelessly or reluctantly. Working too quickly might demonstrate pride, while working too slowly might indicate sloth. The ideal worker, according to these texts, maintains a perfect balance of diligence and humility that few human beings could achieve consistently. The social interactions cataloged in the other penitentials reveal the medieval preoccupation with hierarchy and proper relationships between different categories of people. Every conversation is analyzed for evidence of appropriate deference, suitable topics, proper emotional tone, and correct social positioning. Speaking too boldly to superiors is sinful, but so is failing to show proper respect to inferiors. Enjoying social interaction too much suggests excessive attachment to human rather than divine companionship. while avoiding social contact might indicate pride or misanthropy. The treatment of reading in medieval penitentials reflects the Church's anxiety about unsupervised access to ideas and information. The manuscripts distinguish between different types of texts, religious versus secular, approved versus suspect, simple versus complex, and consider factors like the reader's education, motivation, and emotional response. Reading for pleasure is generally viewed with suspicion, as is reading that stimulates curiosity about worldly matters rather than focusing attention on spiritual concerns. The penitentials' analysis of sleep reveals the moral complexity that medieval thinkers found in even the most basic biological functions. The position in which one sleeps, the thoughts that occupy the mind while falling asleep, the dreams that occur during unconsciousness, the manner of waking, the time spent in bed, all are subject to moral evaluation. Too much sleep indicates sloth, too little suggests pride or excessive anxiety about worldly matters. The ideal sleep, according to these texts, should be exactly sufficient for physical health while maintaining spiritual alertness. Personal hygiene becomes a surprisingly contentious moral issue in the penitential tradition. The manuscripts consider every aspect of bodily cleanliness as potentially sinful. Washing too frequently suggests vanity. Washing too infrequently indicates sloth or disrespect for the body as God's temple. The type of soap used, the temperature of water, the time spent on cleansing, the attention paid to appearance all require careful moral calibration to avoid transgression. The tables reveal medieval anxiety about intellectual activity and the vow pursuit of knowledge outside strictly religious contexts. Curiosity itself is treated as a dangerous sin that leads the mind away from proper focus on divine matters. The penitentials distinguish between necessary practical knowledge and dangerous speculative thinking, between appropriate religious learning and suspect secular education. Even solving practical problems or understanding natural phenomena could be sinful if approached with excessive enthusiasm or intellectual pride. The treatment of emotions in medieval penitentials demonstrates the Church's desire to regulate not just behavior, but the inner life of believers. Every feeling is subject to moral analysis: joy, sadness, anger, fear, love, hate, hope, despair. The intensity of emotions, their duration, their causes, their effects on behavior, their appropriateness to circumstances, all are catalogued and evaluated. The ideal Christian, according to these texts, maintains perfect emotional equilibrium, feeling exactly the right emotions at the right times for the right reasons. The manuscript's attention to children and their behavior reveals medieval assumptions about the moral development of young people. Even very young children are considered capable of sin, and the penitentials provide detailed guidance for confessors dealing with juvenile transgressions. The sins of children are analyzed with the same systematic attention given to adult behavior, though with adjustments for age and understanding. Playing too enthusiastically, showing excessive affection for parents, demonstrating intellectual curiosity, all are potential moral failures requiring correction. The penitential's treatment of illness and physical suffering reflects the medieval understanding of disease as potentially connected to spiritual state. The manuscripts consider the patient's attitude toward illness, their response to pain, their requests for treatment, their acceptance of suffering. Too much concern for physical comfort might indicate spiritual weakness, while too little attention to health might suggest pride or despair. Even the manner of dying becomes subject to moral evaluation, with detailed prescriptions for appropriate deathbed behavior. The deeper one delves into the medieval penitential manuscripts, the more extraordinary their contents become. Beyond the predictable sins that any modern reader might expect to find condemned, these documents reveal a world where the most mundane human activities were subject to moral scrutiny so intense that it borders on the surreal. The scribes who copied these texts, working by candlelight in monastery scriptoriums, were creating manuals for spiritual surveillance that would make modern totalitarian regimes seem relaxed by comparison. One of the most surprising categories of transgression found in several major penitentials concerns the manner of breathing during prayer. The manuscripts distinguish between different rhythms of respiration, different depths of inhalation, different patterns of exhalation. Breathing too rapidly during religious observances might indicate spiritual excitement that was inappropriate to the solemnity of worship. Breathing too slowly might suggest laziness or inattention to the sacred proceedings. Even the sounds made by breathing, whether audible or silent, whether regular or irregular, were considered potential indicators of spiritual state requiring careful monitoring and possible correction. The treatment of yawning in these texts reveals the medieval mind's capacity to find moral significance in the most involuntary physical responses. Yawning during religious services was obviously problematic, indicating boredom or disrespect for sacred activities. But the penitentials go far beyond this obvious transgression to consider yawning in almost any context as potentially sinful. Yawning while working might indicate sloth. Yawning while eating might suggest gluttony or inappropriate satisfaction with material pleasures. Yawning while in conversation might demonstrate disrespect for one's companions or excessive attachment to personal comfort. Even more remarkably, some manuscripts address the moral implications of sneezing, hiccuping, and other involuntary bodily functions. The Church's theological position was that God controlled all aspects of creation, including the most minute details of human physiology. Therefore, these apparently random occurrences must have spiritual significance that require interpretation and possible moral response. Sneezing at inappropriate moments might indicate divine displeasure. Persistent hiccuping might suggest spiritual disturbance requiring prayer and possibly penance. The penitential's analysis of walking reveals an almost obsessive attention to physical deportment as an indicator of spiritual state. The speed of walking, the length of stride, the position of the head, the movement of the arms, the placement of the feet all are considered morally significant. Walking too quickly might indicate pride, impatience, or excessive attachment to worldly goals. Walking too slowly might suggest sloth or inappropriate contemplation of earthly pleasures. The ideal Christian walk, according to these texts, maintains a perfect balance of purposefulness and humility that would require constant conscious attention to achieve. The treatment of sitting and standing in medieval penitentials demonstrates the moral complexity that theologians found in even the most basic postural choices. Sitting when one should stand indicates disrespect for authority or laziness. Standing when one should sit might suggest pride or inappropriate desire to call attention to oneself. But beyond these obvious considerations, the manuscripts analyze the manner of sitting, whether upright or relaxed, whether with legs crossed or uncrossed, whether with hands folded or active, as indicators of inner spiritual state. Coughing receives detailed attention in several major penitentials, with distinctions made between different types of coughs and their moral implications. A cough that interrupts prayer or religious instruction is obviously problematic. But the manuscripts go further, considering whether coughs are genuine expressions of physical need or attempts to gain attention, whether they occur at convenient or inconvenient times, whether they are suppressed or allowed free expression. Even the sound of coughing, whether harsh or gentle, loud or soft, is analyzed for evidence of the cougher's spiritual condition. The penitentials' treatment of looking and seeing reveals the medieval understanding of the eyes as dangerous gateways to the soul that required constant moral vigilance. The duration of glances, the direction of gaze, the expression in the eyes, the response to visual stimuli all are catalogued as potential sources of sign. Looking too long at anything beautiful might indicate vanity or inappropriate attachment to worldly pleasures. Looking too briefly might suggest disrespect or failure to appreciate God's creation. The ideal Christian gaze, according to these texts, maintains perfect balance between appropriate observation and dangerous indulgence. Even blinking becomes a subject of moral analysis in some of the more elaborate penitential manuscripts. Excessive blinking might indicate nervousness or guilt about hidden sins. Insufficient blinking might suggest pride or inappropriate intensity of focus on worldly matters. The frequency, duration, and manner of blinking are all considered potential indicators of spiritual state requiring careful observation by confessors and spiritual directors. The treatment of scratching in medieval penitentials reveals the Church's suspicion of any form of self-indulgence, no matter how minor or necessary. Scratching an itch might be physiologically necessary, but taking pleasure in the relief provided could constitute a form of sensual indulgence. The location of scratching, the manner of scratching, the public or private nature of the activity, the duration and intensity of the scratching all are subject to moral evaluation. Some manuscripts even distinguish between scratching with fingernails versus scratching with implements, each carrying different moral implications. The analysis of nose-picking in several penitential texts demonstrates the extraordinary level of detail that medieval moralists brought to their examination of human behavior. The act itself might be hygienically necessary, but performing it publicly could indicate lack of proper shame about bodily functions. Performing it privately might suggest excessive attention to personal comfort. The manner of disposal of what was removed, the tools used for the activity, the frequency of the behavior, all are considered morally significant. Spitting receives elaborate treatment in the penitential tradition, with careful distinctions made between different circumstances and manners of expectoration. Spitting in religious spaces is obviously serious transgression, but the manuscripts go further, analyzing the force of spitting, the direction chosen, the accompanying sounds, the reasons for the action. Even the consistency and appearance of what is expelled becomes subject to moral interpretation, with some texts suggesting that certain characteristics might indicate spiritual corruption, requiring special attention. The penitential's treatment of irrelated behaviors reveals medieval anxiety about the boundaries between public and private bodily maintenance. Cleaning the ears might be necessary for health, but taking pleasure in the process could indicate sensual indulgence. Using inappropriate tools for ear cleaning might suggest vanity or excessive attention to appearance. The frequency of ear cleaning, the thoroughness of the process, the disposal of what is removed, all require careful moral calibration. Stretching and physical exercise receive detailed analysis in medieval penitential manuscripts, with careful attention to the motivations and manner of bodily movement. Stretching upon waking might be physiologically natural, but taking excessive pleasure in the feeling of muscles extending could constitute a form of sensual indulgence. Exercise for health might be acceptable, but exercise for the enjoyment of physical exertion or for vanity about appearance would be sinful. The duration, intensity, and public or private nature of physical activity all carry moral implications. The treatment of temperature regulation in penitential texts reveals the Church's suspicion of human attempts to achieve physical comfort. Seeking warmth when cold might be necessary for survival, but taking pleasure in warmth could indicate excessive attachment to bodily ease. Similarly, seeking coolness when hot might be practical, but could also demonstrate spiritual weakness. The methods used to regulate temperature, the degree of comfort sought, the time and attention devoted to thermal management all are subject to moral evaluation. Fidgeting and restless movement receive elaborate attention in several major penitentials, with detailed taxonomies of different types of nervous behavior and their spiritual significance. Tapping fingers might indicate impatience or inappropriate eagerness for temporal activities. Shifting weight from foot to foot might suggest spiritual restlessness or failure to accept God's will. Adjusting clothing or posture might indicate vanity or excessive concern with appearance. Even unconscious movements are analyzed for evidence of underlying spiritual disturbance. The manuscript's treatment of facial expressions demonstrates the medieval belief that every aspect of human appearance reflected inner spiritual state. The duration and intensity of smiles, the occasions that provoke laughter, the causes and manifestations of frowning all are catalogued as indicators of moral condition. Appropriate facial expressions for different occasions are prescribed in detail, with careful attention to the balance between excessive emotional display and inappropriate stoicism. Voice modulation receives extraordinary attention in penitential texts, with detailed analysis of tone, volume, pace, and inflection as indicators of spiritual state. Speaking too loudly might indicate pride or disrespect for others. Speaking too softly might suggest excessive humility or attempts to hide sinful thoughts. The rhythm of speech, the clarity of articulation, the emotional content conveyed through vocal tone all are considered morally significant and requiring careful regulation. The treatment of hand gestures in medieval penitentials reveals the Church's understanding of bodily movement as a form of communication that could convey sinful attitudes or intentions. The position of fingers, the movement of hands during conversation, the manner of pointing or gesturing all are analyzed for evidence of pride, disrespect, or inappropriate emotional expression. Even unconscious hand movements are considered potential indicators of spiritual state, requiring attention from confessors. Posture during various activities receives detailed prescription in penitential manuscripts, with specific instructions for appropriate bodily positioning during prayer. Work, eating, conversation, and rest. The angle of the head, the position of the shoulders, the placement of the hands, the distribution of weight all are considered indicators of inner spiritual attitude and requiring careful attention to maintain proper moral alignment. The manuscripts. Treatment of personal grooming reveals the complex balance that medieval Christians were expected to maintain between appropriate cleanliness and sinful vanity. The frequency of hair washing, the manner of combing, the use of oils or other grooming aids, the time spent on personal appearance all are subject to moral evaluation. Too much attention to grooming indicates vanity. Too little suggests sloth or disrespect for the body as God's temple. Nail care receives surprisingly detailed attention in several penitential texts, with careful distinctions made between necessary hygiene and sinful vanity. The length of nails, the manner of trimming, the tools used for nail care, the attention paid to appearance all are considered morally significant. Some manuscripts even address the disposal of nail clippings, with certain methods considered more spiritually appropriate than others. The treatment of clothing adjustment in medieval penitentials demonstrates the moral complexity that theologians found in the most basic aspects of daily dress. Adjusting clothing for comfort might be necessary, but taking pleasure in the improved fit could indicate vanity. Adjusting clothing for appearance might suggest pride or inappropriate concern with how others perceive you. The frequency, manner, and public or private nature of clothing adjustments all carry moral implications requiring careful consideration. The true power of these elaborate penitential catalogues becomes apparent when we consider how they were actually used in the daily practice of medieval religious life. These were not academic exercises or theoretical treatises, but practical manuals that guided the most intimate conversations between believers and their spiritual authorities. Every week, millions of medieval Christians entered the confessional booth, carrying the accumulated weight of their daily transgressions. And there, they encountered priests armed with these comprehensive guides to human moral failure. The result was a systematic examination of conscience that penetrated into the deepest corners of human experience, transforming ordinary believers into specimens in a vast laboratory of spiritual surveillance. The practical mechanics of confession. Using these penitential guides reveal the extraordinary thoroughness with which medieval priests were trained to investigate human behavior. Confessors were instructed to ask specific questions about each category of potential sin, probing not just what actions had been performed, but the thoughts, emotions, and circumstances that accompanied them. A simple admission of anger, for example, would trigger a series of follow-up questions. What provoked the anger? How long did it last? Was it expressed outwardly or suppressed? Did it lead to harsh words or violent actions? Did the penitent take pleasure in the angry feelings? Did they seek revenge or forgiveness? Each answer would generate additional questions, creating a branching interrogation that could consume hours. The training of confessors in the use of these penitential manuals was itself a fascinating process. That reveals the medieval church's systematic approach to psychological investigation. Young priests learned to memorize the major categories of sin and the key questions associated with each. They practiced conducting mock confessions with their instructors, learning to recognize evasive answers, incomplete confessions, and signs of hidden transgressions. They studied the subtle indicators that might suggest deeper problems, nervous gestures, changes in tone of voice, hesitations before answering, excessive detail about minor sins that might be deflecting attention from major ones. The psychological impact of this intensive confession system on medieval believers was profound and lasting. People learned to examine their own behavior with the same microscopic attention that their confessors would bring to bear, creating an internalized system of moral surveillance that operated continuously. The knowledge that every action, every thought, every moment of pleasure or displeasure would be subject to detailed interrogation created a hypervigilant mental state that modern psychologists would recognize as deeply problematic. Medieval Christians became accustomed to living under constant observation, both external and internal. That made spontaneous joy or natural behavior almost impossible. The seasonal rhythms of confession created predictable cycles of anxiety and relief that shaped the psychological landscape of medieval life. The approach of major religious festivals, when general confessions were expected, would trigger weeks of intensive self-examination as believers prepared to account for all their transgressions since the last major holiday. The period leading up to Easter was particularly intense, as Christians were expected to confess all sins committed since the previous Easter, creating an annual psychological ordeal that dominated the spring months in medieval communities. Social implications of this confession system extended far beyond individual spiritual development to influence every aspect of community life. Priests who heard confessions became repositories of intimate knowledge about their parishioners' private lives, creating complex webs of information that could influence social relationships, economic decisions, and political alignments. The knowledge that one's most private thoughts and actions were known to religious authorities created a climate of mutual suspicion and careful conformity that reinforced social hierarchies and discouraged individual expression. The economic dimensions of the penitential system reveal another layer of its social impact. Different sins carried different penances, and many penances could be commuted to monetary payments or charitable donations. This created a complex economy of spiritual exchange where wealthy individuals could essentially purchase forgiveness for transgressions that might ruin poorer believers. The penitential manuals include detailed schedules of equivalent penances, allowing confessors to convert spiritual obligations into material payments in ways that reflected and reinforced existing social stratification. The gender implications of medieval confession practices were particularly significant, as the penitential manuals devoted extensive attention to sins that were considered especially characteristic of women. Female sexuality was scrutinized with particular intensity, and women's confessions were subject to more detailed questioning about thoughts, desires, and behaviors that might indicate spiritual corruption. The assumption that women were more susceptible to spiritual delusion and demonic influence meant that their reports of religious experiences or mystical insights were viewed with special suspicion and subjected to intensive examination. The treatment of children in the confession system reveals medieval assumptions about moral development and the age at which human beings became responsible for their spiritual choices. The penitential manuals provide specific guidance for confessing children, with detailed instructions about how to question young people about their transgressions, without encouraging them to think about sins they might not have considered. This created a paradoxical situation where the process of moral education itself became a potential source of moral corruption, as children learned about possibilities for transgression through the very system designed to prevent it. The linguistic aspects of medieval confession created additional opportunities for misunderstanding and expansion of the sin categories. Many penitents spoke local dialects or languages that were different from the young, Latin-educated priests who heard their confessions. Translation between languages often involved explanation of concepts and behaviors that were unfamiliar to the confessor, leading to elaborate discussions of activities that might be innocent in one cultural context but problematic in another. These linguistic barriers often resulted in the creation of new sin categories as confessors encountered behaviors that were not covered in their existing manuals. The manuscript tradition of penitential texts reveals how these moral categories evolved and spread throughout medieval Europe. Scribes copying these manuals often added their own observations, local customs, and regional variations, creating a constantly expanding universe of potential transgressions. Marginal notes in surviving manuscripts show confessors adding their own discoveries about human behavior, contributing to an ever-growing catalog of ways that ordinary life could constitute spiritual failure. The medical understanding of sin in medieval penitential practice reflects the period's integration of physical and spiritual health. Many manuscripts include detailed discussions of how different sins might manifest in physical symptoms, and how bodily ailments might indicate spiritual problems requiring confession and penance. This medical model of sin created a feedback loop where physical discomfort could trigger spiritual anxiety, leading to more intensive confession, which might reveal more sins, which could cause additional physical stress, creating a cycle of escalating spiritual and physical distress. The international circulation of penitential manuscripts created a standardized system of moral evaluation that transcended political and cultural boundaries. A sin that was recognized in a monastery in Ireland would be evaluated using similar criteria in a cathedral in Italy or a parish church in Germany. This moral standardization was one of the most powerful unifying forces in medieval European culture, creating shared assumptions about human nature and proper behavior that influenced everything from art and literature to law and politics. Pedagogical methods used to train confessors reveal the systematic nature of medieval moral surveillance. Young priests learned to categorize penitents according to their social status, occupation, gender, age, and previous confession history, with different questioning strategies appropriate for each category. Merchants were questioned about different sins than farmers, nobles faced different moral expectations than commoners, and repeat offenders were subjected to more intensive scrutiny than first-time confessors. This systematic approach transformed confession from a simple admission of wrongdoing into a complex social science that required sophisticated training and ongoing education that the psychological techniques described in confessional manuals demonstrate. Sophisticated understanding of human nature and the methods needed to extract complete admissions of guilt. Confessors were taught to recognize signs of incomplete confession, excessive focus on minor sins that might hide major ones, claims of perfect behavior that were inherently suspect, emotional responses that seemed inappropriate to the sins being confessed, and inconsistencies between current confessions and previous ones. They learned to use silence, repetition, and strategic questioning to encourage more complete revelations. The documentation requirements for confession created vast archives of human moral failure that influenced medieval understanding of human nature and social organization. Confessors were required to keep records of particularly unusual or serious sins, creating databases of transgression that were analyzed by church authorities for patterns and trends. These records influenced everything from theological scholarship to legal reform, as the accumulated evidence of human moral failure shaped official understanding of what behaviors needed to be regulated and how the technological aspects of confession reveal how medieval institutions adapted to the practical challenges of processing large numbers of individual spiritual examinations. The development of standardized questioning procedures, written guides for confessors, and systematic record-keeping methods transformed confession from an informal spiritual conversation into a bureaucratic process that could handle the confessional needs of entire populations. This systematization was necessary to manage the scale of medieval confession, but also changed its fundamental character from personal spiritual guidance to institutional moral surveillance. The resistance strategies that medieval believers developed in response to intensive confessional scrutiny reveal the human capacity to maintain some autonomy, even under total institutional control. People learn to confess safely by focusing on predictable minor sins while concealing more serious transgressions, to time their confessions strategically to avoid particularly thorough confessors, and to use the complexity of the penitential system to their advantage by claiming ignorance about specific moral requirements. These survival strategies created a cat-and-mouse game between confessors and penitents that influenced the ongoing development of confessional procedures. The cultural legacy of medieval penitential practices extended far beyond the formal end of the medieval period to influence modern European attitudes toward privacy, authority, guilt, and personal responsibility. The assumption that all human behavior is subject to moral evaluation, that authority figures have the right to investigate private life, and that individuals are responsible for controlling not just their actions, but their thoughts and emotions. All of these ideas that seem natural to European culture were shaped by centuries of intensive confessional practice based on the elaborate penitential manuals. The psychological legacy of this system is visible in the distinctively European forms of guilt, shame, and self-examination that characterized Western culture well into the modern period. The habit of intensive self-scrutiny, the assumption that ordinary pleasures are morally suspect, and the expectation that authority figures should have access to private thoughts and behaviors. All of these psychological patterns can be traced back to the medieval confession system and its systematic cataloging of human moral failure. As we examine these extraordinary documents today, we see them as artifacts of a worldview that seems almost alien in its thoroughness and intensity. Yet their influence on European culture was profound and lasting, creating psychological and social patterns that shaped Western civilization for centuries. The medieval penitential manuals represent one of the most comprehensive attempts in human history to catalog and control human behavior. transforming ordinary life into a spiritual battlefield where every moment held the potential for salvation or damnation. In their pages, we see reflected not just medieval obsessions with sin and purity, but fundamental questions about human nature, social control, and the relationship between individual conscience and institutional authority that continue to resonate today. As our journey through the moral landscape of medieval Europe draws to a close, we find ourselves in the quiet space that exists between past and present, between the fevered anxieties of those long-dead believers and the comfortable distance that time has granted us. The medieval world we have explored tonight, with its impossible moral demands, its intricate catalogues of sin, its tragic martyrs, and convenient escape routes, feels both alien and strangely familiar, like a half-remembered nightmare from which we have finally awakened. Imagine yourself now, in your own bed, in your own time, free from the crushing weight of moral surveillance that made every breath a potential transgression in the medieval world. You can sleep naked without confessing it. You can enjoy your food without calculating the spiritual cost of pleasure. You can laugh without measuring the moral implications of joy. You can love your family without worrying that human affection might compete with divine devotion. You can work with pride, rest with contentment, and dream without fear that even your unconscious mind might betray you into sin. The extraordinary catalogue of human transgressions that we have examined tonight, from the simple act of oversleeping to the complex theology of sanctified warfare, reveals not just the peculiarities of medieval religious thought, but something deeper about the human condition itself. In their obsessive attention to every detail of daily life, medieval moralists were acknowledging a profound truth: that human existence is inherently complex, that our motivations are always mixed, that the line between virtue and vice runs through the heart of every moment and every choice. Yet their solution to this moral complexity, the creation of ever more elaborate systems of surveillance, confession, and control, reveals the dangers that arise when institutions claim the authority to regulate not just behavior, but the inner life of human consciousness. The medieval church's attempt to catalog and control every aspect of human experience created a form of spiritual totalitarianism that made ordinary life itself a form of rebellion against divine order. In trying to eliminate sin, they had made sin universal. In trying to perfect humanity, they had made human nature itself criminal. The tragic story of Marguerite Porete reminds us that even the most sincere spiritual seeking can become dangerous when it challenges institutional authority. Her mystical insights into divine love, her profound experiences of spiritual union, her sophisticated theological understanding, all of these gifts that might have enriched the spiritual life of her community, became evidence against her when they threatened the Church's monopoly on religious truth. In her flames, we see not just medieval intolerance, but the eternal conflict between authentic spiritual experience and institutional religious control. The mysterious penitential tables that we explored reveal the bureaucratic mind's attempt to quantify and systematize the unquantifiable mysteries of human moral experience. In their meticulous attention to every conceivable transgression, from breathing incorrectly to scratching inappropriately, we see both the admirable desire to take moral life seriously and the absurd results that can emerge from excessive systematization. These documents remind us that institutional attempts to regulate human behavior often reveal more about the anxieties of the regulators than about the realities of human moral experience, the spiritual apartheid that characterized medieval Christianity, where the wealthy could purchase salvation while the poor faced impossible moral demands. Illuminates the eternal tendency of religious institutions to serve the interests of power rather than the cause of justice. The same church that taught that God showed no partiality between rich and poor created a salvation system that perfectly mirrored earthly inequality. In this contradiction, we see not just medieval hypocrisy, but the ongoing human struggle to reconcile spiritual ideals with institutional survival in a world where power and wealth determine organizational success. Yet perhaps the most important insight from our journey tonight is not about medieval Christianity, but about the nature of authentic moral and spiritual life itself. The ordinary believers who struggled under these impossible moral systems, who confessed their small pleasures and natural emotions as sins, who lived in constant anxiety about their spiritual standing, these people were engaged in a form of moral seriousness that, however misguided in its particular expressions, reflects something essential about human dignity and spiritual aspiration. Their willingness to examine their lives, to take responsibility for their actions, to seek forgiveness for their failures, to strive for something higher than mere survival or success. All of these impulses that the medieval moral system, channeled in destructive directions, represent. Authentic human spiritual capacity that transcends any particular religious or cultural context. The problem was not that medieval people took morality too seriously, but that they allowed institutions to define moral seriousness in ways that served institutional rather than human needs. The distance that time has given us from medieval moral anxieties allows us to see both the universal and the particular in their spiritual struggles. The universal elements, the search for meaning, the desire for moral clarity, the need for forgiveness, the longing for transcendence remain as relevant today as they were 1,000 years ago. The particular expressions, the specific prohibitions, the institutional mechanisms, the cultural assumptions reveal themselves as historically contingent and often arbitrary constructions that served specific social and political purposes, rather than eternal spiritual truths. This perspective can offer us a gentle liberation from our own moral anxieties and spiritual insecurities. Just as we can now see the arbitrary nature of many medieval moral prohibitions, future generations will likely view our own moral certainties with similar bewilderment. The specific forms that moral and spiritual concern take in any particular time and place are always influenced by cultural, political, and institutional factors that may have little to do with authentic spiritual insight or moral truth. This does not mean that morality is purely relative or that spiritual seeking is pointless, but rather that we must learn to distinguish between the eternal human need for moral and spiritual orientation and the particular forms that different cultures and institutions create to meet that need. The medieval believer's anxiety about taking pleasure in food may seem absurd to us, but their underlying concern about the relationship between physical and spiritual life touches on questions that remain relevant and important. The medieval mystics' experience of divine love may have been expressed in language and concepts that seem foreign to modern sensibilities, but their fundamental insight into the possibility of transcendent experience speaks to capacities that remain part of human nature. The medieval reformers' protest against spiritual inequality may have been framed in theological terms that we no longer use, but their concern for justice and authenticity in religious life addresses issues that continue to challenge spiritual communities today. As you settle into sleep tonight, you can rest in the knowledge that you live in a time and place where your most basic human responses, your pleasure in beauty, your love for family and friends, your pride in your accomplishments, your enjoyment of simple physical pleasures are not classified as sins requiring confession and penance. You can be grateful for the psychological freedom that allows you to experience joy without guilt, love without anxiety, and rest without the fear that even your dreams might betray you into transgression. Yet you can also carry with you an appreciation for the moral seriousness that characterized medieval spiritual life at its best. Their willingness to examine the ethical dimensions of daily life, their recognition that small choices have large consequences, their understanding that moral and spiritual development require ongoing attention and effort, all of these insights remain valuable even when separated from the specific institutional frameworks that gave them expression in the medieval world. The great gift that historical distance provides is perspective, the ability to see both the wisdom and the folly in past human attempts to create meaning and order in a complex and often confusing world. The medieval believers whose moral struggles we have examined tonight were not more or less wise than we are, not more or less spiritual, not more or less human. They were people like ourselves, trying to make sense of existence, seeking purpose and meaning, struggling with the gap between their ideals and their realities, hoping for something better than what this world alone can provide. Their particular solutions to these universal human challenges may seem strange or even appalling to us, but their fundamental concerns remain our concerns. Their search for authentic spiritual life continues in different forms today. Their desire for moral clarity, their need for forgiveness, their longing for transcendence, all of these impulses that drove the creation of medieval Christianity's elaborate moral systems continue to motivate human spiritual seeking in our own time. Medieval worlds Obsession with sin reveals not just the peculiarities of a particular historical period, but the eternal human awareness that life involves moral choice, that actions have consequences, that we are responsible for the kind of people we become and the kind of world we create together. Their specific definitions of sin may have been arbitrary or oppressive, but their underlying recognition that human life has moral dimensions remains profoundly true. As the night deepens and sleep approaches, you can let go of the medieval world's moral anxieties while holding on to their deeper insights about human dignity and spiritual possibility. You can rest in the comfort of knowing that you are not required to confess every moment of pleasure or pride, while remaining open to the ongoing invitation to live with greater awareness, compassion, and authenticity. The medieval believers who populated our story tonight have long since found whatever peace awaits beyond the struggles of earthly life. Their anxieties have ended, their confessions are complete, their penances fulfilled. Whatever truth there may be about ultimate spiritual reality, whatever divine justice or mercy governs the universe, they have discovered it now. Their long journey through the moral labyrinth of medieval Christianity has reached its destination. For those of us still walking the path of earthly existence, their story offers both warning and wisdom. Warning about the dangers of allowing institutions to define our spiritual lives in ways that serve institutional rather than human needs. Wisdom about the importance of moral seriousness, spiritual seeking, and the recognition that our choices matter in ways that extend beyond their immediate material consequences. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, you can be grateful for the freedoms that historical change has brought while remaining open to the eternal human task of becoming more fully who you are called to be. You can rest in the confidence that authentic spiritual life does not require the impossible moral perfection that medieval Christianity demanded, while continuing to grow in awareness, compassion, and wisdom. The medieval world's elaborate catalog of sins has passed into history, but the human capacity for moral growth and spiritual insight that it attempted to cultivate, however imperfectly, remains as vital today as ever. In the quiet darkness of this night, free from the medieval world's moral surveillance, you can continue that ancient human journey toward greater authenticity and love, guided not by institutional demands, but by the gentle wisdom that emerges from a life lived with awareness and compassion. Sleep well, knowing that tomorrow will bring its own opportunities for moral choice and spiritual growth, opportunities that you can meet with the freedom and dignity that is your birthright as a human being, free from the impossible moral demands that made medieval life a constant spiritual battlefield, yet open to the genuine moral and spiritual possibilities that make human existence meaningful and beautiful.